Hey y'all, good morning. Good morning. Welcome to this live event. So just super excited for this opportunity. Give me 1 second. Give me 1 second, y'all. Let me get my computer All right, so this is my first time going live on Instagram. Sorry, on LinkedIn. See, I'm so used to going live on Instagram, but this is my first time going live on LinkedIn. So just bear with me if there's any technical issues that come up, but just really excited to be here to talk with y'all today about where we are with strategic planning and just the new face of strategic planning in the nonprofit sector. So as we know, the nonprofit sector is evolving really quickly, which is not a surprise. As we see the business sector or the private sector also advancing really quickly as well. And so with that, it's really important that we recognize as consultants to nonprofits that we also have to keep up with the way that the ecosystem is changing as well. And so I say that to say what's been really important for us as a firm who prioritizes strategic planning for mission-driven organizations, it's really important for us to understand what organizations need right now and where they're trying to go in the future in order to ensure that what we're delivering to them as consultants are relevant to what they need as an organization. And so before I jump into anything, let me do a introduction of myself because I think that's extremely important. So let me do an introduction of myself. So my name is Dr. Sonia Daniels. I am the founder and president of S. Daniels Consulting. Hold on 1 second. All right, so I think I got the mic situation resolved. And so, again, my name is Dr. Sonia Daniels. I am the founder and president at S. Daniels Consulting. We're an almost 7-year-old strategy consulting firm, and we are founded and operated in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, but we serve clients all throughout the United States. So we've had the privilege of working with organizations not only here locally in Baton Rouge, we have a lot of clients that we've worked with in New Orleans as well. And then we've had the privilege of working with nonprofit organizations and other mission-driven organizations across the United States. And so it's just been a really great experience to work with a number of different nonprofit organizations and mission-driven organizations, and to really understand like what those unique needs are for those individual organizations, and how we can just help them, meet their community in a more efficient way and help them really increase their overall impact and revenue for the organization. So that's a little bit about what we do at SDC, a little bit about myself, because what I'm recognizing is that I don't always do a good job at essentially sharing, what it is that I do as a business owner, as a owner of a consulting firm. And so for me, I'm just super passionate about nonprofits. I've always been involved in the nonprofit space, even since, I was a teenager. My mom always made sure to have us involved in some type of initiative, whether it was, doing some type of community service or giving back, just really being involved in the community as a way to really understand not only how we could help people and serve other people, but always just an opportunity to understand that, like, I grew up, even though I didn't grow up in the most privileged household, we had what we needed. And so it was always an opportunity to work in the community and really help me be grateful for what we had in our house. And so always been super passionate about just giving back to people, being a part of being in the nonprofit space. And so with that, what ended up happening was that evolved my interest in nonprofits over long periods of time. And so with that, when I went into college, one of my first jobs was actually working at the YMCA in Lafayette, Louisiana. And so I really loved that job. And that really put me in a position to understand that I could have a career serving people like in the nonprofit space. Like I could get paid to do nonprofit work, because there was always this narrative or this assumption that like folks would always, when they would ask me like what I was studying in college, when I would say nonprofits, they would be like, how are you going to make money for working for nonprofits? So they didn't really understand like the business model of nonprofits and how that worked in practice. And so I thought that was really interesting. And so eventually, once I left undergrad, went into a degree program where I could study nonprofit management and leadership. And then that ultimately led me into public policy, which is an interest of mine as well. And so this work that we currently do at S. Daniels Consulting has been a true evolution, you know, since even before I graduated high school, but not really knowing that it could lead me here. So just super grateful for the journey of growing this business and really being able to, again, help nonprofits. But what I want to talk about today is, so what we've been doing as a firm, as we continue to grow and as time continues to pass, we have been working on refining how we engage in strategic planning with nonprofit organizations. Now, if you are somebody who has worked at a nonprofit, or if you are somebody that has worked adjacent to nonprofits, you know that nonprofits tend to have very unique needs, right? Because they are organizations that are set up to provide some type of service or programs directly to their community. What that often means is that when you're working so closely with people, especially people who are vulnerable, right? When you think about a lot of the nonprofits that exist, they exist because they are providing something to close a gap or to close a need for somebody who might be in a really vulnerable position, right? And even beyond nonprofits, when we think about social service agencies like the Department of Child and Family Services and Department of Education, and like all of these different entities that serve the community, they usually are engaging or interfacing with people when they're at their most vulnerable. And so because of that, the needs of those organizations tend to be quite different from, let's say, a for-profit company, for example. So when we think about like for-profits, for example, I go to Target to get a few things I need for my house or maybe to buy a few snacks, but it's not necessarily a situation that like I'm vulnerable and I have this dire need that Target needs to like resolve. That's not the case a lot of times with for-profits. And so with that, their focus a lot of times tends to be on profits over people, which is interesting, but that's another conversation. When it comes to nonprofits are essentially created because someone recognizes a gap in the community or there's this need in the community that needs to be fulfilled. And so that is traditionally why, you know, people in some cases have started nonprofits. Now we understand that there are other, you know, priorities and desires and reasons why people might engage in charitable work. Maybe they've discovered that, you know, there's some tax benefit there. And so we know that that is an obvious reason that people start nonprofits too. So we won't glaze over that. But today, what the focus is talking about is how we engage in strategic planning with organizations that are truly committed to increasing their impact and improving their service offerings to their community. So when we first started the firm back in 2017, we were kind of just doing a lot of different services just to really meet like the overall needs of nonprofits. So essentially, when we first started the firm, we kind of, I guess you could say, like provided a bunch of wraparound services. And so what that meant is that, you know, we helped people do their formation paperwork. We helped people, you know, do very basic things like think of nonprofit names, like get their social media accounts set up, like really just all types of different things. And so as our work evolved over time, we started to discover that there was a very niched area that we knew that we could provide like really great services in, and that was strategic planning. And so we recognize that there are a lot of different firms that do strategic planning. That's also another obvious observation as well. And so for us, what we wanted to ensure that the way that we engage in strategic planning set us apart from the way that other agencies and firms were engaging in strategic planning. So we took some time to develop our own framework for strategic planning that really meets the needs of the current public sector, ecosystem in the way that the public sector currently functions, and then also being mindful of a lot of the needs of not only the people who work in the organizations, but again, the needs of their external stakeholders as well. And so from that, we were able to not only develop a new framework for strategic planning, but we were also able to work with a few clients and essentially pilot that framework for strategic planning to really test and assess and evaluate what works, what doesn't work, what we need to go back to the drawing board with, et cetera. And so some of the ways that we engage in strategic planning, again, as I mentioned, are a bit different from how we see other firms do strategic planning. So one of the things that's really, really important for us is that because we recognize the pain points of nonprofits and of organizations who have some type of mission-driven priority or focus, we understand that there are specific things that those organizations tend to need a little bit of support with, tend to struggle with. And that comes a lot from like previous experience of working in nonprofits, right? So I've been a part of teams at nonprofits who were pulled in to do the strategic plan. And so from that, I was able to observe a lot of the challenges that were posed to team members when they were brought in to do a strategic plan. They didn't necessarily have a voice in how the strategic plan was facilitated. They also didn't necessarily, when I say they, I mean me. When I have been a part of previous strategic planning teams at previous jobs, I recognized that there wasn't always a space to like have a voice in the process. I think one of the other things that used to be really frustrating for me as a former nonprofit employee was that when the strategic plan was said and done, it would be delivered to us to say, hey, you're responsible for executing on, these 3 goals, for example. Well, that's a challenge and a disconnect, because if that person was not a part of the strategic planning process, but then they're being told that then they need to fulfill, these certain goals or activities, and they have no context or knowledge about why those things are important, how those decisions were made, how they're being measured for success. Like there are gaps in that process. And so when I thought about like my previous experiences, when it came to strategic planning at past jobs, I wanted to also bring that into the framework that we have designed for how we engage in strategic planning with clients. And so let me get into the nitty gritty of it. But what I want to talk about first is like how we got to the point of deciding it was time to develop like a completely new framework for strategic planning in comparison to other frameworks that already exist out there. And so I have a few notes that I'm going to be looking at. So if y'all see me looking down, I'm looking at my notes. One of the biggest things that I think is most glaring as a consultant to nonprofits, our mission-driven organizations, is thinking about the fact that only about half of operating nonprofits have an actual formal strategic plan. So only about half of them. I think what's even more interesting is only about a half of that half that actually has a formal strategic plan actually effectively implements their strategic plan. And so what's been interesting to that point is, which also is a reason why we feel like these conversations are necessary, is that a lot of the folks who have been coming to us who are interested in strategic planning have worked with other consultants to engage or to build a strategic plan. And then essentially they vetted consultants, they hired someone, they paid someone to do a strategic plan, and the nonprofits still they ended up feeling like they didn't get what they paid for. And so basically, I say that to say a lot of our clients that have been coming to us have previously had strategic plans done by other consultants, but did not meet their needs or what they were looking for. And so I think what's problematic there is that, for one, we know a lot of times nonprofits don't just have money to just like throw away, right? They don't have money to just give to a consultant to get something done, and then they still don't feel like they have gotten that work fulfilled. And so that's also been really interesting for us too, when we think about how we engage with work with our nonprofit clients, because we want to be mindful that they get more than what they pay for, essentially. So that's been also important too, when we think about how we have started to develop this framework for strategic planning. And so there's some other things I want to mention as well when we thought about when it came to how we started to develop this framework for strategic planning. And so there's a few things that tend to happen in nonprofit organizations, or really, I would say this really in any organization who is not engaged in strategic planning. There's a few things that tend to happen that I think kind of like either go under the radar, or there are issues that folks just have not figured out how to address these things. So one of the biggest challenges when it comes to organizations not having a strategic plan, or when they just don't engage in a strategic planning process that makes sense for them, it puts them in a position to inefficiently utilize their resources, or inefficiently allocate how to utilize those resources. And in a lot of cases, when we talk about resources, we're talking about money resources, we're talking about human capital, so use of staff and volunteer time. Even board time is a big thing that I think is often misused in the nonprofit space as well. And then another issue is inconsistent funding and unsustainable practices within that organization. And so when organizations do not engage in a strategic planning process that makes sense for them, they start to kind of just, or not even start, they get in the habit of just spending money and not knowing like where the money is coming from, where the money is going. When new money is coming into the organization, because they have not engaged in strategic planning, there's really no true plan of how the money will be spent. I think organizations kind of just like spend it and then hope for the best, and then that's not really helpful to the way that they function in their organization. I think another reality of just not having a great strategic plan for an organization is that there's a lack of direction of where they are wanting to go as an organization, or where they need to go as an organization. And so one of those biggest things that come up when we talk about lack of direction is the idea of mission drift or mission creep. Which happens in a lot of nonprofits when there's no clarity on what they actually need to be doing to fulfill their mission, and then how do they also meet their impact goals as well. I think what also ties into that is just unclear goals just overall for the organization. And the lack of direction is essentially like a foundation of why there are certain challenges that constantly come up with nonprofits. So of course we talked about mission drift or mission creep. I see this pretty often in nonprofits when they are starting to chase opportunities. And so what that looks like is that, let's say there's a nonprofit and they know they need like a certain amount of funding for a program. Let's just say they need $25,000. And so what starts to happen is, because if there's not a clear direction of where the organization wants to go, or if there's not a clear set of goals for the organization, what they start to do is they start to find basically any opportunity that can bring in that $25,000. And in some cases, there's not an intentional thought about, does this $25,000 match our goal or help us match our mission or help us move forward to our goals? It starts to put the organization in a position of just grabbing at any opportunity that comes their way, because there's no strategy behind what they, need to do or should be doing. And so mission creep is a big one. And so the challenge with mission creep is that if you're not careful, the organization ends up doing work or, securing partnerships or getting grants that don't meet what they actually are capable of doing. And so because of that, then they're not able to fulfill those partnerships. They're not able to meet those grant guidelines or grant goals and objectives. And that starts to create like a snowball effect of issues. And so lack of direction is a big challenge for nonprofits who just don't have a strategic plan or haven't taken the time to engage in strategic planning in a way that makes sense for them. Also, another challenge that comes up is reduced impact, which is huge for nonprofits. And I think is a thing that I don't often see conversations happening about. But one of the biggest things that one of the biggest areas that is an issue under reduced impact is essentially ineffective programs. And so the focus of a lot of organizations are having programs that provide some types of services or resources or something to their community. So if those programs are ineffective or inefficient and organizations are not taking the time to strategic plan, then essentially at some point, and I hate to say this, but the organization will come just not helpful or not useful to the community. And so folks won't engage with that work because it's just not effective to what they need. And so also too, when we talk about reduced impact, we also talk about missed opportunities as well, right? So again, when organizations are not functioning in the best way possible to meet the mission of their organization, what starts to happen is that people recognize that, y'all. People have conversations with each other. So just for example, like let's say you go eat at a restaurant and you didn't get great service. You're going to go and tell your friend, your significant other, you're going to tell everybody. And some people even, put it on social media or they leave reviews. Like they're going to let people know, I was not satisfied with the service I received at this restaurant. Do not go there. Nonprofits are no different, y'all. I've worked at nonprofits where the program delivery was just not the best. And so the people who were on the receiving end of that program or that service, like they express their frustration, but I guarantee they go and tell other people about their experience with this nonprofit and let other people be known, or let it be known to other people, do not go to that nonprofit. I don't like the way they treated me, or I didn't get what I needed from that organization. So people talk, and that's also a matter of trust and reputation, which again is really big when it comes to any type of organization, whether you're for-profit or nonprofit. And so that loss of trust starts to create a perception for people that the organization is not effective. They don't do what they say they're supposed to do. Like that really becomes a reputation piece. And so I want organizations and I want leaders at organizations to really start thinking about, how do we make sure we have a good reputation as an organization? That also ties into other things as well. So it's not just ineffective programming that ties into organizational reputation. There are things like the way staff is treated ties into organizational reputation. The way that the organization engages in business is a part of the whole reputation of the organization. I'll give an example as a consultant. So of course, a lot of times when we are seeking out new opportunities, we might engage in the RFP process. And what's been happening is that there's been a lot of nonprofits putting out RFPs. And so we'll take the time to respond to the RFP and we'll submit it, and we'll never get a response to it. We won't even get like a thank you for, replying to this RFP. When they make a decision, there's no like information that's offered to us about, how they made that decision. That's even a part of reputation as well when it comes to being a nonprofit. There's a certain level of business efficiency that needs to exist in the nonprofit space. And again, a part of that ties into strategic planning and just making sure that you're functioning in a way that's, effective to everybody involved. And I think one of the other areas I want to talk about when we talk about strategic planning is also just when organizations do not engage in strategic planning, what tends to happen is that there's a decreased opportunity for organizational learning, which is essential across the board, again, whether you're a nonprofit or a for-profit. One of the biggest things that strategic planning does for organizations is that it allows you to take a step back and engage in evaluation of the organization. So whether at the organizational level, whether at your programmatic or service level, with staff, with board, just whatever area that might be, strategic planning allows for organizations to really engage in an evaluation and an assessment of how they're functioning as an organization. And so what tends to happen is that if organizations are not taking a pause to evaluate what's working, what's not working, what often happens is that organizations just keep doing the same things over and over. And in some cases, expecting a different outcome, but then that does not work in reality if you haven't taken the time to really assess, are these programs effective? Are these services effective? Is my staff happy? Are they operating in a way that's, useful to the organization? Do board members understand what their roles and responsibilities are? Do they know exactly what they're supposed to be doing for this organization? So when organizations don't take the time to strategic plan, or when they engage in a strategic planning process that's not super useful to the organization, what happens is that there's no opportunities for evaluation. One of the other things that comes into play is that, so in addition to evaluation, there's no opportunity for feedback loops as well. And so when we think about feedback loops, we're thinking about feedback from different areas or different units within the nonprofit to be able to offer feedback and say, hey, this is working really well. This is not working well. I think we should go another direction. I don't think this partnership is great for us for whatever reason. We have this money coming in, but there's some issues with that. So there's a number of things that organizations should be looking out for when they think about engaging in evaluation or feedback loops. Another part about, or another element of decreased organizational learning is the inability to adapt to change. And so one thing I know as an adult is that change is one of the most constant things that happens in our world, whether it's work, whether it's personal life, whatever it is, change is something that's always happening. And so it's important for nonprofits to have the ability to adapt to changes in the environment. So whether that's on a political level, whether that's with technology, whether that, and especially with nonprofits, when we talk about like fundraising and philanthropy, even now, the face of philanthropy is starting to change. And so it's important for nonprofits to recognize that I'm not going to say might, they need to be able to adjust to the changes in the fundraising world when we talk about how philanthropists are giving in ways that are not, that are different, or that kind of change the way that organizations need to approach their thoughts about fundraising too. So that's important as well. Another issue that comes from decreased organizational learning due to lack of strategic planning is board ineffectiveness. A lot of times people come to us and they say, my board members are just not engaged. There are usually root causes that are very common around why board members are not engaged. Anywhere from, again, they simply don't know what they're supposed to be doing. They don't know their role. Their skills and assets are not being used to the best benefit of the organization as well. And so it's important to recognize all of those other things, or those things when it comes to board ineffectiveness. And then the last two I want to talk about around decreased organizational learning before I talk about this framework for strategic planning is that it's really important to understand that not engaging in a strategic plan or not having a strategy for your organization are some of the main causes of leadership and staff turnover, and then also compliance issues as well. Oh, excuse me. And so again, it's important to understand that strategic planning is a necessity. I'm not just saying this because this is what we do, but I am saying this because this is what we do. So strategic planning is just absolutely necessary. So now segueing into our framework that we utilize at S. Daniels Consulting. So over the past, I'm going to say probably year or so, we have started, or we have designed this framework. So it's essentially our methodology for how we engage in strategic planning that has 4 different elements to the full strategic plan framework. And so the name of the framework is called the RISE method for strategic planning. That is what we call it within SDC. And so within the RISE framework for strategic planning, there are 4 key elements that we use when we engage in strategic planning. Now, as I mentioned, we've had the chance to pilot this framework with a few different clients. And so now we're in a space to really start to see the results that are coming from the framework that we've been utilizing. Some of the greatest data that has come out of the results from the framework is that our clients who we have piloted the framework on have been seeing success with the implementation and execution within their action plan that is a part of the full strategic plan process. And so 2 data points I want to share with you all that has come from our success with the framework. One is that we are seeing a 35% increase in funding from our clients. So basically them, being able to increase their funding within their organization. We've seen that increase be about 35% just within 6 months of implementation of their strategic plan. Also, what we've been able to see is a 30% increase in program effectiveness, which of course ties into the overall organizational effectiveness. But our clients who have utilized the clients we have utilized the framework on have been able to see a 30% increase in their program effectiveness. And that's really important because, again, all of those issues that I just mentioned are starting to be alleviated because now the clients that we work with have a plan in place that they can easily utilize. We stay on with them through implementation because we recognize, again, a pain point for nonprofits is time. Like time, and even on the for-profit side as a business owner, I just told someone yesterday, time is a very valuable resource for us, and it's something we don't have the ability to waste. And so we also recognize that with nonprofits as well, is that they do not have a lot of time when it comes to facilitating or executing programs and services. So as a part of our methodology, we make sure that we stay on through implementation and execution. So the I in the RISE framework talks about how we stay on with our clients through implementation. We also use that as an opportunity for us to track our success as a firm because we do have success metrics as consultants. And so one of our success metrics is how quickly do organizations adapt and adopt the new strategic plan. And a major part of strategic planning is change management. And so it does not make sense for us to just give an organization a strategic plan and expect them to execute on it. And it's not saying that they cannot do that, But again, because we recognize the pain points of nonprofit organizations, we recognize that sometimes they just need some extra support there through that change management process. And so that's where we come in with our strategic planning methodology. We do stay on through implementation. We do measure success on their end, and we also measure success on our end as well to ensure, we're functioning appropriately as a consulting firm. Another element of the RISE methodology or the RISE framework for strategic planning. So we talked about the I being implementation. The R in the framework talks about being relevant, right? And so again, the major point of this conversation is to talk about how strategic planning, the old methods of strategic planning just do not work anymore. So one of the elements is that we want to always make sure that our methods of strategic planning are relevant to where we are as a society, as just a unit of how organizations need to function. We want to always make sure that what we're delivering to organizations and what they're implementing and executing is relevant to what people need right now. So we don't focus on the past. We don't think too far into the future, but we think about the immediate present of where we are and how to make sure those organizations are able to function where we are right now in the world. So the R is relevant, the I is implementation. Now the E, I'm going to jump to the E first and then come back to the S. But the E talks about making sure that there's equity built into the process in all forms, right? So one of the models we really love using when it comes to how we engage in strategic planning is the collective impact framework, which is a favorite framework of mine. And so what I love about the collective impact framework is that it allows organizations to be able to invite all of their stakeholders to the table, to be a part of any decision-making processes, to be a part of their planning process, which of course, strategic planning really guides that planning piece of the work. And so what the collective impact model does, it essentially ties into, if you think about like a bottom-up approach in business. So the bottom-up approach is making sure that the people at the bottom, which I don't like that name, but I'm just using it for talking about it in a technical way. But the people at the bottom, so in the nonprofit world, we look at this as like your frontline staff. So like the staff members who are like out, feet on the ground every day, making sure programs and services are facilitated. Those are the people who we consider the frontline staff. And so anytime you engage in strategic planning as an organization, it's important that the frontline staff is a part of that project so they can talk about the realities of their work. They can talk about what they are seeing from their purview, so that they can offer insights about what makes sense, what doesn't make sense, what work, what doesn't. Also having volunteers be a part of the planning process as well is really helpful, because also volunteers have a very unique perspective when they volunteer with organizations. And so it's important that they have their voice heard in the planning process. Board members should, of course, be a part of the planning process as well. And so the collective impact model really make sure that all of your stakeholders have a voice or have a say in how you make decisions and how you plan for your nonprofit organization. Again, because this is all community work. And so everybody needs to be able to have some say in how things go. That also, when we think about it from like a psychological perspective, that also allows the opportunity for buy-in, for people to feel more committed to the process because they were a part of it and they had their voice heard. People do not want to be told like what to do and how they need to do it. People want to offer their perspective because everyone's perspective is valuable. And so that's really what the collective impact model focuses on. So when we tie that into equity, the big part of that is making sure that there are equitable opportunities for everyone who is affiliated or associated with the organization to have their voice heard. So that's like the most basic way we can talk about like equity, right? So equity in like decision making, equity in who gets a say in what happens. But then also when we talk about the outcomes of the strategic plan and how the organization will evolve, then because equity was built into the planning process, it also naturally starts to be built into the way that organization functions as a whole. And so the reason why we think equity is super important as a foundation for strategic planning is that it becomes a culture for the organization, and that is how they function. So for us, it's not just about planning, it's also about culture building as well, because in order to execute and implement an actionable strategic plan that works, there also has to be a culture change that comes with that as well. Again, when change management happens, in a lot of cases, it forces the nonprofit to stop doing what they were doing in the past and to start really creating space and opportunity to do new things that provide new outcomes and new results for that organization. So that's a little bit about the E in the RISE framework for strategic planning. Now, I'm gonna be honest with y'all, the S is escaping my mind right now, and I should have had it pulled up in front of me. So there's the RISE. So R is relevant, I is implementation. Let me find the S, y'all, because it would be so wrong of me not to talk about what the S means. And I promise y'all, I know what all of them mean because I was the person that created it. But let me pull it up so I can tell y'all exactly what the S portion means. So, okay. All right, so the S is stakeholder engagement. And so the S is a big part of, and I think I kind of touched on it when I talked a little bit about equity, but the S is stakeholder engagement. So basically all of the things I talked about, making sure that all people have a voice in the participation of the planning process. The equity talks about utilizing equity and inclusivity in the planning process. So I did get that mixed up a little bit. So when we talk about equity oriented, we utilize a framework called the anti-oppression framework. And so what's super important about that is, again, as a nonprofit, because you are serving the community, you cannot, and I know right now when we talk about DEI, there's a lot of discourse around it, folks wanting to move the equity from the process. And I recognize why people do that, but we are not in a world where you cannot engage in equity. Like it's the reality of it. And so when we talk about having an equity oriented approach to strategic planning, what that typically looks like is that sometimes we might conduct like equity audits, to see how the organization is addressing systemic inequalities. And if you've been involved in nonprofit work, you know that folks sometimes refer to nonprofits or the nonprofit sector as the nonprofit industrial complex, because just because we're doing community focused work, it does not mean the sector is not exempt from a lot of challenges that we see, a lot of systemic challenges that we see in other sectors. And so it's really important that when we approach nonprofit work, we think about it from an equity-oriented lens, especially an anti-oppression lens. Some other things that we do when we talk about equity-oriented approaches in strategic planning is that making sure that when an organization needs to refine or develop new policies as a part of the change management, they're also able to think about how these policies promote diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then also thinking about like, how do we engage in equitable resource allocation, making sure that the resources are spread equitably across the organization, but that also resources are distributed in an equitable lens, and that people are prioritizing marginalized and underrepresented groups, because more often than not, for nonprofits, that is who they are serving. Groups of people are people who are historically marginalized, historically excluded, underrepresented, upper. Let me pause for a second. Underrepresented and under-resourced is what I'm trying to say, and all the words are like mashing together. So again, when we think about nonprofit work, the reality is that nonprofits are essentially serving people who are historically excluded, historically marginalized, and people are communities that are underrepresented and under-resourced. And so because of that, the planning that has to happen for organizations, there needs to be equity orientation. There's no ways to get around that. So I wanted to mention that as well. So again, let me go through these again before we wrap up. So at SDC, because of the great work that we do at nonprofits, we have spent the last year or so developing this framework. And so the framework is called the RISE framework. Because of the way we've developed this framework, we use this again as a methodology for how we do strategic planning with folks. So again, making sure that it's relevant to where we are today, this environment, just the work that we do in the nonprofit sector. The I stands for implementation. So the goal for all of our clients is that they're able to immediately adopt their strategic plan. We don't want them to do the strategic plan and then let it sit on the shelf for, months and years. We want them to, the day we finish, the day we have our project closure, if we're working with like a short-term client, we want them to immediately start using their strategic plan. However, our approach to strategic plan is that implementation has to be a necessary part of that planning process. So typically, again, when we're working with clients who are interested in strategic planning, we ensure that implementation is built into the project itself. So we do not like leaving clients to figure it out on their own. We prefer to stay on and work through the implementation with them. The S in the RISE framework stands for stakeholder engagement. Again, we utilize the collective impact model when we talk about effective stakeholder engagement. And then the last part of the four pillars of the RISE framework is equity oriented. And for this, we utilize the anti-oppression framework. So with all of that said, because I've been talking for the last 45 minutes, I hope that this information was super helpful to y'all. I did not, or I cannot see any comments on my end. Oh, wait, there are comments. Sorry. Okay. I'll take that back. Now I can see the comments. So I see people agreeing change is definitely inevitable. Thank you, Chi. Chi said this is amazing information. Thank you, E said this is fantastic. Vanessa, I really appreciate all of y'all's comments. Again, this is my first time streaming on LinkedIn, so I'm getting familiar with all the different pieces of it. And the last comment came from Kina. Thank you so much, Kina. Relevant implementation, stakeholder engagement, equity oriented. Yes, that is our framework for strategic planning. And so we've been piloting this framework for a little over a year now, and we're starting to get results, our success metrics on both the client side and our side as strategic planners. And we're starting to see really great results come from that really speak to the success of the framework and how it's helping organizations do better work. So we're just super, super excited about that. So that is all I have for y'all today. This was such a great live. Love talking about strategic planning, love talking about nonprofits. So would love to connect with y'all if you want to have more of these conversations virtually or in person. But just grateful for y'all being here with us today. So I hope that everyone has a beautiful Thursday and a great rest of your week. And feel free to reach out to S. Daniels Consulting if you know someone who could benefit from our strategic planning services and the work that we do as a whole. Please send them our way. So thank y'all again and have a beautiful day, y'all. Take care.